Hi everyone. My name is Bhaskar Chattopadhyay. I am an author and translator. Um, this year, 2021, is the centenary of the birth of one of India's luminaries, filmmaker Satyajit Ray. He was not just a filmmaker; he was also a writer of children's literature. He was a screenwriter. He excelled in all departments of filmmaking. But I am here to talk to you about a book that marks or celebrates his cinema. The book is published by Westland. This is what it is called, The Cinema of Satyajit Ray. And the book is divided. I've written this book. The book is divided into two parts. The first part is full of essays, one essay each for the 39 films that Ray has made in his career, feature films, short films, documentaries, everything. And the essays talk about his filmmaking process and several anecdotes, analyze the films, and so on and so forth. The second part of this book is has interviews of people who have worked with Ray, his collaborators, his actors, and also some of contemporary filmmakers, critics, who and film scholars who have been influenced by his work. Do read this book. It's a lot of hard work that has been put in the research. I hope you read this book and enjoy it as much as I did researching the material and writing about it. The Cinema of Satyajit Ray by Westland. It's available everywhere. Thank you.
The fine line between fantasy and horror with our esteemed guests. Our first guest, Neil De Silva. Considered as one of the forerunners of contemporary Indian horror literature, Neil De Silva is also a known name in the Indian literary world. He has won screen adaptations deals on 4 of his books. He's also spoken about writing on various platforms such as TEDx, IIT Kanpur, and others. He is the president of the Indian chapter of Horror Writers Association. Our second guest, Alisha Kirpalani. Alisha is based in Mumbai, India. She's previously authored 2 fiction books, Out with Lanterns and a Smattering of Darkness and Ghosts in Our Backyard, is her first foray into non-fiction. Our next guest, Mayur Didolkar. Mayur Didolkar has published 3 novels and several short stories and one short story collection titled Nagin. At present, he is working on his 5th novel as well as several screenwriting projects. Our next guest, Siddharth Nirwan, will be leading the discussion. Siddharth Nirwan is an ENT surgeon and a horror author. He's written 3 horror books. He's an active member of the Horror Writers Association. He organized India's first horror literary festival in September 2020, booth.com. He has been invited to speak on All India Radio twice regarding his contribution to Indian horror literature. I request Siddharth Nirwan to kindly take this discussion forward.
Hello. All of you can hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, we
hi.
can.
Yeah. So my name is Siddharth Nirwan, and I welcome you again to another, in fact, the first horrifying session at the Pune International Literature Festival 2021. And today we'll be discussing about the fine line between fantasy and horror. And all of our panelists have been introduced. So I'd like to ask and I'd like to kick off this session with Mr. Neil Silva. So, Neil sir, tell me, kicking off with the title of our session, that is the fine line between fantasy and horror. So, how much different or similar are the two? So, what is that fine line that we are talking about? One point we had the fantasy, which is a wide umbrella that includes fantasy fiction, imaginative horror, and at another end we have this horror, which I believe what is the paranormal or the true stories or the real incidents of horror. Please.
So, to begin with, thank you, PILF, for having me. It's always a great opportunity to be with you, and always the audience is lively. So, I hope we do get a lot of questions at the end of this session. So, Siddharth, to kick off this session, we are starting to talk about fantasy and horror. So, what I would like to begin with is saying that there is a very big misunderstanding when it comes to these two genres. First and foremost, these are not at two opposite ends of the spectrum. They are not on, like, fantasy is on one hand and horror is on the other. It's not like that. In fact, horror is a subgenre within fantasy itself. I know that a lot of people might not agree with me right away, but let me put it like this. Fantasy is a huge domain. It contains a lot of subgenres within itself. Like, if you talk about fantasy, we have high fantasy, we have low fantasy, we have gaslamp, we have grimdark, we have steampunk. I could go on. And in those, we also have paranormal fantasy or paranormal horror. That is where we fit in. We, the ghost writers, we all come within that zone called as the paranormal fantasy or the paranormal horror genre, including Stephen King, because he writes about ghosts. We also have vampire fantasy as a separate genre within fantasy itself. So, because that is such a huge genre within itself, that we have it as well as a separate category, as a separate subgenre. Having said that, what is fantasy after all? That is what we need to first understand. What is fantasy? Fantasy is something that we pull out of our hats. It's our imagination. And all authors, whether it is fiction or non-fiction, we do imagine. We do let our minds wander. We do pull things out from the realm of the imagination and we put it on paper. So that is where fantasy comes from. The only difference is when we write horror, we try to intersperse our imagination with our phobias, with things that are related to our horror reality. So that is the main ingredient of our horror reality.
Okay, so Niels' connection seems to be a little bit, interrupted. Uh, I hope you can hear me, Niels. Anyway, I'll get back to you. I'll get back to you. And uh, coming to Alisha. Now, Alisha, coming from the first family of Indian horror, right? The Ramsay brothers, the Ramsays. What do you think was the prime reason behind the consistent success of the Ramsay films and TV series for not just a couple of years, for not just one decade, for over 3 decades, from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s? And how much role did this fantasy played in them, Alisha?
Hello, everybody. Hi, Siddharth. Hi, Mayur, and hi, Neil. Uh, Basically, I think the adrenaline of fear is something that most human beings are hooked on to. Uh, Also, I think the Ramsays being pioneers in the field, today, when you look back, you'll probably find it all funny. You'll probably mock it and you'll probably say, like, what is this? But if you actually put it in the milieu that it was pretty ahead of its time. All right. You were dealing with a genre uh, and a family that was there for 3 decades. All right. What did they do right? Don't look at the masks. Don't look at uh, there was no special effects. Don't look at any of that. They didn't use any of these devices. They used one simple device that is creating fear. Coming back to what Neil said, and I'm in agreement with him, I think the difference out here was that horror is defined by mood. It fantasy does not necessarily create fear, but horror is supposed to create fear. And the Ramses did that successfully. Now, if you're criticizing their technique and so on forth, which a lot of people tend to do or whatever, please put it in perspective. They wanted to scare people, and they did. You've got to give full credit to them for that, given the limited means, given the consistency with which they came out. And I think that is something no one can deny, that they have remained in everybody's memory as the horror kings of India.
Absolutely. And just to share my experience, and I think Neil sir knows it very well because I have narrated it so many of times. My love for horror starts with the Ramses and it ends with the Ramses because when I was in 7 years old, I happened to see this film called Purana Mandir. And I was thrilled to the core. And those were the days of the video cassettes and the video libraries. And I happened to see all of their films at that tender age. Yeah. Okay. Generally, children are not allowed to see, but I saw all of the films. And my concept of horror still stands today as the Ramses. So
How
whatever the
nice.
supernatural, the entity, the haunted houses, the Purani Haveli, Purana Mandir, Band Darwaza, Tehkhana, for me, that is horror. For me, that is horror. That will always remain. No matter
How
how
wonderful.
much you put psychological horror today on this. I'm true Ramses fan, and Neil sir is a testimony for it, right?
How
Because we have
sweet.
had this discussion about the Ramses so many times. Neil sir, so you are back, and please continue with
Yeah.
your answer.
Yes. So I don't know where I got cut off, but yeah, that is basically what I said. I think you got all of it because I can see Alisha following up on my reply as well. So we could go ahead and I'll take it on at some other point in the discussion.
Neil sir, I want to ask another question, just a follow up to the first question that I asked you, right? So, because we are talking about these two terms, fantasy and horror, right? I am very sure that I have been asked this question, and you definitely must have been asked this question that Neil De Silva, you're writing about these Yakshinis and you're writing about Pishacha and all these supernatural creatures, characters, etc., etc. Do you believe in them? Do you believe even a bit in them?
Yes. Now, if a horror author is not asked this question, there is something wrong. So obviously, the first thing that we are asked is whether you believe in ghosts and spirits, and I think most of the times we are asked that as a kind of a dare. If you don't believe in ghosts and spirits, how can you write about ghosts and spirits? That is the undercurrent within that question. So I would say that yes, I do believe there were some aspects of it that I believe, that there were some that I'm still exploring. I'm trying to find out things about it as I write, as I try to bring things into my books and talk to them about talk about them to my readers. I'm also learning on the way. But having said that, I'll tell you this, Siddharth. No two horror authors have the same kind of belief in ghosts and spirits. One of us might believe in them more, some of us might believe in them less, some of them might even be skeptical. It is very, very possible because we don't write horror always to scare. A lot of people write horror just to entertain, and scaring is becomes an element of that entertainment. Where do I stand? I have already told you about that. But the thing is that people who do not, or who have scant belief in ghosts and spirits, they basically have to conjure things from their imagination. And that is where their horror becomes more of a fantasy than the people who write, say, for example, non-fiction. Because if you write non-fiction, if you write stories of a paranormal investigator, you're essentially writing things that they have gone through. But if you're writing something like Yakshini or Pishach, the books that I wrote, now for Yakshini, I had to create an entire world because it is not based in, it's not based in any of the villages that we know. It's a fictional village. The Yakshini concept itself that I created for my book it came from fiction, it came from fantasy. So I would consider that as a kind of a dark fantasy, which I wrote. So, yes, when we write horror, we do straddle a lot between these lines of reality and imagination. And I think all horror, good horror, in fact, it comes from reality. You need to have something relatable. Your character has to be one of us, because only when the character is one of us will you get scared, will you feel that that thing which is scary, spooky, can happen to us as well. So that is the line that you have to always keep on. And while writing horror, though you know that it is fantasy, you have to remember that it has to come from realism. It has to come from our lives.
Yeah, and I think even if not realism, as Alisha said and as you said, I mean, horror for us is basically what is it? It's entertainment. It's a form of entertainment. And I wonder that J.K. Rowling has been asked this question whether you believe in wizards, or J.R. Tolkien has been asked if you believe in elves and hobbits. Of
Since
course,
we're talking about Tolkien and Rowling, they are fantasy writers, right? While Rowling has written a low fantasy, Tolkien is more of an epic fantasy, right? But the things are, in both of those, there were a lot of horrific elements in both their works. Whether it is the Dementors in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, or the various creatures that come in Lord of the Rings, in the entire premise of it, these are all very, very dark creatures, and they come essentially in horror. So why don't we call Harry Potter as a horror novel? Why we don't do that? Because Harry Potter has several other elements which are not horror. So it is basically a whole masala package, the kind of thing that we use, the term that we use. And horror is just one of those elements which is there in Harry Potter. Even if you see our epics, at the risk of sounding a little controversial, in our own epics, there are Danavs, there are demons. So those are the horror elements of our epics. We don't count them as horror works because horror is not on the fore. It is not, it is in the background, it is an element. But if you write a story which is about one of those creatures or one of those elements, then it becomes horror.
absolutely. And now, moving on to Mayur. Now, Mayur, as a creator of a successful horror book series, do you think that including the elements of traditional Indian fantasy, elements like Nagin or Baital, in the modern day stories is significant to be accepted by the Indian horror fans?
I think in order to answer that question, actually, I would like to go back to the discussion between the fantasy, the differentiating line between fantasy and horror. I think if I were to sort of put it in a broad term, I would say that fantasy. So there is a saying that tragedy plus time equals to comedy. So I think similar to that, fantasy plus existential pain equals to horror. So a lot of contemporary as well as old horror writing, so the classic horror novels that we speak about, have their roots or have their thematic resonance coming out of some kind of an existential angst that can be identified with the generation that those novels were written in. So if you look at Shining, which is Stephen King's probably one of the most identifiable novel written by Stephen King, at the root of it, it is actually a marriage story. So I mean, when the film Marriage Story came, I said that okay, if this was set in winter resort in Connecticut or wherever, I don't remember where Shining was set, it would still be a horror story. So I think it is very important for us to look at this in the perspective of the existential angst that the writers try to address. So whether you look at a classic film like Night of the Living Dead, the time when it came, actually one of the biggest problem was the punk generation which was coming up, and so Night of the Living Dead at some basic level is actually about children not listening to their parents, or children constantly rebelling against their parents. And that is why countries which had that problem, so Night of the Living Dead, if you observe the success pattern of that film worldwide, it's a very interesting graph. So the societies where rebellious children was a bigger problem, the film went through a roof. Where it was not a problem, people did not understand that particular film. Now, linking it to the works that I have written, I think Nagin was, if I were to look at my project, Nagin was my fun project. So I just wanted to have some kind of a fun with the idea of people who are capable of taking shapes of snakes or taking shapes of reptiles, and so they are switching back and forth. A lot of the basic ideas or the basic themes are still derived from the society that we are living in and the times that we have lived into. It is just that I think, as Neil mentioned somewhere, that I think in fantasy probably those elements are toned down to a certain extent to allow the other aspects of the story to come to the forth. So just as we do not call Harry Potter a horror novel in spite of it having elements that are pretty scary or frightening, I think in a fiction work like Nagin, you would have things that would scare you here and there, but they are part of the larger concoction that I try to create using that one particular phenomenon.
Yeah, and I also wanted to list as upon this thing, Mayur, that as a horror writer, as an Indian horror writer, right, who's primarily catering to the Indian horror readers, right? So, do you think that including touches of Indian elements, right? Indian folk force, like Nagin Batal, are very necessary, because otherwise, an Indian horror reader will say, "Yeah, why should I read you? Why should I read the Indian horror authors? I'll go and read Stephen King. Yeah, time and time
Absolutely.
tested. Right? I'll go and
Absolutely.
read his son. Right. So I think, is it a compulsion on us, or I mean, it doesn't matter to us, right?
I think there is a very fundamental writing advice, and that kind of applies to all genre that we are talking about. Is write what you know. So, by what do we mean that by write what you know? Is basically you can write in any genre that you want to write in. It can be a literary fiction, it can be a rom-com, it can be a fantasy or a horror. But the characters and the background and those things, you still need to have some kind of a first-hand interaction with those places. So and again, I mean, what we are doing is that we are adding that just one element of improbability. So let us say if I have worked as a banker, I used to work with banks in my prior to starting my own work. So that point of time, I would see how banks operate, what are their policies on certain things. Let us say renting out a locker. Now I have to imagine only one thing which is not going to happen in real life. That one improbable thing. That okay, what if the locker opens on its own every night, and there is only one locker door that springs open on its own every night, and there is a story behind that, and then you start working on the story. But the rest of the background will resonate only if people can see the kind of people that they meet and talk to in their day-to-day lives. So I think it is very important in terms of, as you have mentioned, in terms of getting the tone and the color right. What you really need to do is you really need to bring your observations either from your real life or from some other research that you have done into the element for the improbable thing to become believable. So you don't have to, you cannot sell everything which is improbable. So if everything else sounds true to the reader, then he'll say कि हाँ ठीक है ये सब है, लेकिन because it's a horror novel, they are saying that that locker opens by itself and maybe a ghost comes out of it. I'm just improvising as we go. I have not written a story about a haunted locker so far, but so I would say that for a horror writer, the compulsion to sound realistic, horror and also to a fantasy writer, the compulsion to sound realistic is even greater, because there is one place where we will be demanding of our reader that they suspend their disbelief in order to believe what we are trying to tell them. So, in order for readers to go along on Harry Potter's journey, the character of Harry Potter as a child or as a boy needs to be extremely convincing in order for the rest of the magic and the Hogwarts school and everything else to become palatable for the reader.
Absolutely.
Siddharth, I've got a take on this. Your question was basically about, whether we should incorporate Indian elements, and do we do that to connect better with the readers? So I think we have spoken about this before, but this is my first opportunity to speak, to tell it up to the PILF audience. Yeah, I see that the trends of our horror readers, also the audiences, is vastly changing. So there was a time when, yes, we were quite stuck with our supernatural lore and legend, and we could understand only boots and chudels and dians. But now what is happening is, with the influx of foreign entertainment so much in India, especially look at the success of Squid Game. Now Squid Game is horror, and that is a kind of horror that India so far has not understood. That is gore, right? So gore India has never understood. But when something like Squid Game comes, it becomes a monster hit even in India. Our audiences are changing. Though we are still writing about yakshinis and nagins, we are doing that because there is a very good audience for that as well. And even we enjoy writing it, our audience enjoys reading it. But people are also shifting towards more modern genres, subgenres within horror. They are going towards psychological, they are going towards paranormal, also gore, as I said, grimdark. So these are the things that are working, and our audiences are accepting them. So we should, the thing is, what we give to our audiences, that is what they will take. As it is, there are so few horror authors in India, right? So what we give, that is what the audiences will take. If we experiment, and if we give them new kind of books, if we give them new kinds of subjects, then I'm sure the Indian audience is smart enough to pick up those books and read as well. Only we have to make that attempt.
I totally agree with that. And now moving on to Alisha again. Now, Alisha, having seen the Ramsey brothers in action from so close, and now also worked upon the book based upon their true paranormal encounters, how is your belief in this other world, this other world evolved since childhood? Because I read your book from start to end, and I definitely understood what we're trying to say through the book. But do you believe in the presence of spirits? And if you do, then how does this belief that I believe in this world, how does this affects our lives, our day-to-day lives, and our living?
So basically, what I feel is that why, at this one question I've not been able to understand, is that people don't seem to question God who they've not seen, okay, as much as they question spirits. I wonder, is this because they are afraid to believe they are true, right? I also feel there's a very odd thing out here that I feel spirits, unfortunately, have been stereotyped by the Ramses and Stephen King as usually being evil. Okay. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. To come directly to the point, the journey of this book started is because I did encounter an actual spirit myself. Uh, Usually, so do I believe in them? 101%. And that is, in fact, when I went backwards into my recesses of my memory. My uncles were, most of them were fortunately alive at the time. I was able to speak with them uh, and get whatever I could from everybody. So it was more a journey. And the book questions a simple thing: did horror choose the Ramses, or did Ramses choose horror? So it's actually a book on many different levels. It's a journey of my own. It's a journey of uh, horror. It's also a journey of hope. I would really like to say this. Where fiction and non-fiction, I'll come to the dividing line between these two. I know Neil has done both, but I have done non-fiction. All right. I've done fictional short stories, and I've realized that non-fiction is a lot tougher. Uh, the reason being is that people are somehow expecting you to be scarier. All right. So Neil, where my hands are tied because I'm not going to write masala. These are real life experiences. So, and there's a universality to all of it. They are white, okay, and they are this, and you get dissed for it. And I'm like, but I'm not writing fiction. In fact, if you gave me a fictional world, I'd be able to go gung ho. I'm writing non-fiction. I'm telling you this is what they saw. So you cannot expect a Ramse ka darwaza ka bhoot there or a Purana Mandir ka, because they didn't see that technically. Neither have I. So I think that is one area where I find that non-fiction, people's fear makes them also diss it and diss you a lot, like for it. Correct? Uh, so
Totally with that.
that
Yes.
that is one area where I feel that people want to fantasize further. When they're horror readers, they want to be fully afraid. When what I'm trying to tell you, this is what we saw. I'm not trying to scare you. This is the experience. It's not at all diluted. It's not at all enhanced. Uh, as far as we come back to a question which both of them spoke about, the Indianization. I've got to agree with both of them on this front. I think if you want to get the masses to read, you're probably better off using some Indian elements, all right? Because the OTT platform watcher is very different. Today, the Ramshays, Trishul coming and, people banging their heads and recovering their eyesight and all that, it's not going to work anymore, but it still may in the smaller villages with the masses, with everything. So I think it also depends on your readership or viewership on that front. Finally, I'll make one point on the differential between fantasy and horror. I mean, these points are great, actually, uh, made by Neil and Mayur. They're really good. Is I think the realm and the ambience. Horror is an internal ambience. You're creating fear inside the mind. Okay. But I think fantasy usually requires a much larger canvas for all those elements, like a mythical world or a magical world. I think because I don't believe you can do Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe you can do a lot of the rings with sitting inside the character's head or watching through their eyes. But in horror, you have to be in the head of the person being haunted so that you can feel their feelings. I think internal setting is a lot more in horror than it is in fantasy.
Agree with that.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm still a believer in the Ramses, and I believe that the same kind of stories and the same kind of films and the same kind of series are going to make a
Wonderful.
comeback very, very, very soon, because that love, internal love for that true, what we learned horror through the Ramsey Brother films. It's never going to
But
die out.
do you not feel that I think it would work as well, but I think the characterization needs to be a little stronger. I think today the audience doesn't want that 1D character, of or 2D character, what it is. I think it could still work, but I think the characters need to be better defined. I think, Neil, if you think about it, even if you made a Thakur and a Haveli, if you went deeper into their persona, Mayur, it's a lot more relevant today. Okay,
Yes,
people
yes.
want to know more about the internals of human beings to understand their motivation. So I think that is a big change.
So that
You
is
could
what
do
I'm
it.
doing.
Yeah, yeah,
Alisha, to tell you about it. So I'm writing a book, The Curse of the Maharani, and in that the dedication is to the Ramses on the first page itself, because it takes off on the genre. But then, when I was writing it, I discovered the exact same thing that you're talking about. That we cannot just work in that premise any longer. We cannot
yeah,
work just with the supernatural elements. So I need to get into the mind of Samika, who is my character, and what drives her, what brought her to the Haveli. It cannot be just a college trip like before,
perfect.
so what has brought her here, and why does she do the things that she does? Because even in the West, the horror of the girl, the last girl kind of thing, where there's a slasher when there's only one girl standing at the end, it doesn't work anymore. So there needs to be a strong driving point for both, for the monster as well as for the human
Exactly.
characters in it. And that is where the fun is, and that is where I think we have grown. So the
Yeah,
Ramses gave us the initial, the feed for starting off horror in India. But as the decades have gone, we have grown by leaps and bounds. Not just us, but also our audience. And now I think we need to do more complex stuff because we are ready for it. I'm not telling that we should forget where we started from. We should forget our lore, because in fact I am the person who wants to take the Indian lore global. I want people all over the world to know about our Yakshinis and Chudails. I want that. But at the same time, we have to move with the times and we have to give people what they understand better in this age.
absolutely. More layers essentially is what it is.
Yes,
Not
man.
just You're not just skimming the surface of
Yeah.
horror, which is what the core is. You need more layers. The depth is what we need to bring into horror. Also, I think, to raise it to a genre right now, it's not, sadly, it's considered, even in writing and everything, not a genre which is worthy. Now, if you look at Frankenstein, that's a masterpiece of literary fiction. It's out and out horror. I think that blend, that stereotype of horror needs to be broken, which can only come in, with good writing. And that is nuanced writing, layered writing, writing which is not out only to create fear, but to also create, and you actually able to feel the characters, feel their plight. And that can only come with character, not just, Trishulaya, bells ringua. You know what I mean to say? It worked then. But today, I think the world has grown exponentially, really at a fast pace. Anil, I think it's a great attempt. We need to show people that horror is not a B grade genre. Okay,
Absolutely.
uh,
That
and
is
that
that is
is
the
something.
statement
Yeah,
that I need to make. That even I want to
yeah.
make that statement.
We are not a
You
B
know, it
grade genre.
really it hurts me when people say that we don't read horror because horror is not a respectable genre, or it is something that we don't want to read. So it actually hurts me. It's an assault on me, because I know what horror is. I know that horror can be so literary. It can some of the
Yeah,
biggest works in literature are horror, like Dracula is a
yeah.
standout masterpiece. Frankenstein, which you mentioned. Then there is of course the picture of Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There were
Yeah,
so many
Edgar
titles.
Allan Poe. Look at
Edgar
Edgar
Allan
Allan
Poe's
Poe. Yeah,
entire body of work,
yeah,
so all these things. So why people actually, when people actually say that horror is a lowbrow genre, it is basically they are talking about themselves. They are not talking about the genre. Because they are in denial. They do not want to face, their own fears. Probably horror is too relatable to them. It cuts too close to the bone, and probably that is why they feel that we want to stay away from the genre, because there are people who say that if we don't see a problem, the problem goes away. And that is what. But I feel, personally speaking, horror reading as well as writing has made me much bolder, much braver, and I've been able to introspect. I've been able to think, why do certain things scare me? Why does it happen? What is the psychology of fear? So all these questions. They keep on juggling in my mind, and that is what I explore through my genre, and that is what I feel readers should also do. And this excuse of I don't read horror because it scares me, I think it's an excuse, because we do sit on thrill rides, we do tear ourselves in so many different ways, we take risks in our personal and professional lives, but we are not willing to take a risk on paper in reading a book. How frivolous can that be?
I think in many ways horror is probably one of the most inward focused genre. So in many ways it focuses us to look within ourselves. So Lord of the Flies, which I consider to be one of the greatest, although I don't think it is categorized as such, but I think it is one of the
It
scariest
is.
books that I have ever read. And at the end of the book, there is a question. So somebody says that we have to protect the boys, and the other person asks, "But who will protect us from the boys?" or something like that, or who will guard the boys? Now that question is such a profound introspection on the kind of people that those children who have been moved on that island has become, that it is almost uncomfortable to ponder. So many times the kind of questions which horror asks us in the guise of a very interesting story are the questions that we ourselves avoid discussing, or we ourselves avoid talking about, because they make us too uncomfortable, or we are afraid that they will make us confront that particular part residing deep within us, which we are not very comfortable addressing. And that is one of the reasons why over a period of time people have started categorizing supernatural or horror as genres that are lowbrow. I really don't think, I would dare anybody to read a book like, say, Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, or I Am Legion
Yeah.
by Richard Matheson. I can go on.
Yeah,
Something Wicked This Way Comes. I recently read that book, so that came to my mind, by Ray Bradbury. So surely people like Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, or Shirley Jackson were not horror writers because they were lowbrow writers. But I think it is some, we are really not comfortable discussing what we are afraid of, and the horror makes us question that by asking us a different question. So many times what we are really worried about, like I go back to the example of Shining. So what we are really worried about is not the ghosts that are living in Overlook Resort, but by how the breakdown of a marriage and recurring phenomenon of alcoholism is going to destroy the child's life. And that is something, that's an uncomfortable story that every one of us has seen or witnessed or lived through, unfortunately, in our own lives. And that is why going back to that story, even in the guise of a haunted resort story, doesn't make us comfortable at all. And I think to a certain extent, as Neil mentioned, some amount of repulsion or revulsion towards horror comes out of that personal discomfort that many of us might feel.
absolutely. I agree. I agree with you, Mayur. Okay, I don't know whether Neil Mayur have read the books that you did. Neil, in Ghost in Our Backyard, you mentioned the side benefits of horror. I actually think that even philosophy, your spirituality increases if you actually try to look at the spirit world. So, Siddharth, if you notice, the book is about spirits and spirituality. It's an absolute attempt to blend the two things, that these journeys we have of fear of things. I had someone which I consider the greatest compliment I've received, and this is for all those who want to diss the genre, where she said, when I finished Ghosts in Our Backyard, I closed the book and I said, I'm not going to be afraid of ghosts anymore. And she says, she's a Sikh, and she said, I'm going to close this fear in my guru's box. And she said, honestly, I'm not afraid anymore. Because if I believe in my guru, I will also believe that those who are around us are sent here for our protection. So that is something that people don't realize, that horror is not here to only titillate and make you afraid. Give it a chance. We're all trying to add the elements. Don't force us to be in that space where basically kachra hai. It's not kachra. It is clearly, and this, I'm not a pure horror writer. I've written romance as well. I've written relationships. And I've used the same approach in both my books, or all three of my books. I want you to understand. In one book, I wanted you to understand people. In this one, I want you to understand spirits. Okay, it's my attempt to tell you, try and create compassion, empathy, understanding. So we are trying to break out of this horror genre, and I'm telling you, Neil, I have tons of my friends. Arey Baba, we can't read horror. Till I have literally said, can you please read it? Please read the half in the day and half in the night. And they were glad they did. We've got to push them.
Among my readers, I get this a lot, but then some of them do pick up the books. So if you go to my Amazon page of any book, you'll see the reviews. Most of them start with, "I never read a horror book, but I picked up this book, and I am so glad I did." So
Yeah.
those that ends up being a 5-star review from a person who never read horror before, but then
Yeah.
read. And somewhere, it's finally, I think it's all about being honest with your work. Be honest with your writing. If you do that, then readers will anyway pick it up, whether it is fantasy or whatever that you write. Yeah, that's it. So that.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I just wanted to add to it. I really like the way you connected all the stories in the end to Bhagavad Gita, Quran, and one more, I think, Bible. You mentioned the
Thank
verses from there. Okay. So I wanted to, we are almost running out of the time and last 5 minutes. But definitely, I'd like to have your opinions about where do you see the future of Indian horror literature in the coming years? Okay, I'll have a response from all of you. I think starting with the Mayur, you can start.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, we need to look at this question also in terms of how the people who practice this craft, so how people like me, Neil, Siddharth, and Alisha would like to see our roles changing over a period of time, because definitely there is a change. So the way probably now, I give an example of Mr. Narayan Dharab, because he was the first horror writer that I read in Marathi when I was a school going child. So probably the kind of life that those people led as author is no longer feasible, let us say, for us. So I think the roles of writer is also changing, the way publishing is changing. So we saw changes like self-publishing and the onslaught of digital book reading. So in my case, I got my first opportunity to publish a book with a publisher because of digital reading. So when Juggernaut came out with the reading app, the first novel that I published through a publisher was going to was through them. So I think in case of horror, we are going to see a certain amount of uptick in demand, probably because of the OTT and probably because of the digital content, which is increasing day by day, because there is definitely a lot of appetite there. So you only have to see the success of people like Mike Flanagan, who I think me and Neil, we
Yeah.
both admire a lot, to sort of
Super.
understand where we are going. And and those content are being very well received in India as well. So I think we will need writers who are adept at writing in different mediums, so not just novel or not just short story, but also the writing for screen, writing for web series, etc. People who can make our case, because to a certain extent, and I think in that sense I admire Neil a lot, because he has been doing this relentlessly for the last 5 or 6 years on social
Yeah.
media, in terms of putting forth the case of supernatural and horror as a genre in India. And I think he has done a tremendous job, first through the community called For Writers by Author. Am I correct, Neil?
Yes.
And then subsequently through the other initiatives that we have talked about. I think that will become a kind of a model for a lot of us to work on, because we so this is not a time for people who are shy to promote their work to be on the stage, let me say. So if we are sure of the quality that we are writing, I think we will need to make a case not only just for our individual talents and individual works, but also for the body of work which is being created or which is being generated through this genre, and then have it forward integrated into translating into other languages, translating into digital content, translating into screenwriting, etc. And that way, so what we are talking about is people who are practitioners of that craft rather than just being writers.
Okay,
Thank
guys.
you
So
for your
basically,
kind words.
we are actually almost out of time. So I've been, the
I'll just
organization.
put my last word in there.
Yeah, please.
You asked about where do I see horror going? I see it from the past 5 years. It has grown so much. From one, we became 40. Now we have at least 40 writers in India. I see it only expanding, only growing. Not just that, we are going to explore new territories. We are going to break new ground. And a lot of new kinds of horror books are going to hit the market. We are going to move away from the supernatural and paranormal that we are only familiar with. And most importantly, last sentence, this is what horror is going to do in the next 5 years. I see it is going to earn a lot of respectability. That is what is going to happen.
Cheers to that.
Here.
My 2 bits worth is a very simple one. I personally want to bring the literary element into the supernatural. because I'm a literary fiction writer. I hope people, I don't diss me and continue keeping me there. So I would love to see more of psychological horror, which I think is a genre that's neglected, but has huge scope. I think the return of the short story in its format of, the way it was written, uh, basically, I think when we link good writing, literary writing with horror, we may make strides finally in this field.
We'll have big
So,
winners.
yeah, that's where I'd like to go.
Okay, guys. So I think now we have time for some audience questions. I'm just waiting for the organizers to put forward the questions. And the first question comes from Ashisha Chakravarti. How do you thread the fine line between the realism and fantasy while writing in this genre? So any one of you can take the question. Already we have answered this question, I think. But
Hello, Ashisha. When I start with any horror novel that has to do with realism, I start with my character first. So it is the character has to come from a real world. The setting has to be real as possible. The conflict also would be largely a human conflict. Like in Yakshini, the conflict is about a girl growing up in a male-oriented society. So that is something that is very difficult for a girl from a rural setup to do in India, as we know it. But then I add the element, the vehicle that is telling my story. That is a supernatural element in Yakshini. So that part is fantasy. The Yakshini is fantasy. The Yakshini is the one who delivers the girl from the situation, who helps the girl, and also at the same time is a curse upon the girl. So that is what I have done even in Maya's New Husband. The settings, the characters come for me, they come from the real world. That is because I want people to understand that this could happen with them also. The premise is very real, but the resolution, the conflict itself at times, that will have largely supernatural undertones, overtones.
Yeah. So may I take a stab at this, or would you like to move on to
we
the next
get to another question. There are a lot of questions actually. So, okay. So this question is from Deepti Menon and Alisha. So it's directed to Alisha. Alisha, the Ramses depended on multiple special effects to provide their chills. So you say people want to fantasize. So is that scarier? I mean, putting special effects is that makes the entire thing scary?
I think
Because
I think to put special effects on the visual medium is essential, because it ups the ante and raises the level of horror for sure. But if all you're going to have is every minute boo boo coming in with no depth below, I think that's going to fall flat. I definitely think special effects, sound effects, correct, all of that adds to the entire mood, which is different from books. But I think on screen, you definitely the need of special effects would help. Again, it depends on the genre, whether you're doing an out and out, monster, or if you're doing most definitely add to horror as a genre. Sound effects, all the embellishments definitely add to it.
oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so we are waiting for the next. And it comes from Anupama Jain. So Anupama Jain, and now the question is directed to Neil. So Neil De Silva, my daughter is watching and she says you look very happy for a horror writer. Oh my god.
I want to ask your daughter why does she think that horror writers
You're
look
supposed
sad
to look dull a little bit, actually.
and long face? No, we horror authors are very happy. You should come to watch us during our discussions when we are not on screen. We just have a whale of a time. I mean, we are just pulling each other's legs. So we are like this. Yeah.
So rightfully, Neil, you're possessed with happiness.
Yeah. I would like that. That's a
Yeah.
good thought. Possessed with
Yeah.
happiness.
Yeah. Okay.
So this question was, Stephen King always says this, that somebody is always asks this question, Stephen King, that so you write all these dark stories. So how was your childhood, right?
Yeah.
So that's very funny.
Stephen
Okay.
King's childhood was very painful. I know about that. So I've read about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Deepti Menon again. Neil, you have blended the old and the new so beautifully in your horror novels. How do you walk that line? How do you know not to go overboard? And I'll just like to add a little question from my side, because you have experimented with everything from supernatural, paranormal, psychological, gory. Okay. So what is your response? What is the audience reaction to your books, and how do you do that? How do you manage all these different subgenres?
Let me take Deepti's question first. Deepti, thank you for your kind words also. And yes, a few of my books, especially as far as I can think of, Yakshini, Maya's New Husband, and Pishach, all three of them have a modern world setting, but the backstory goes far back. I think I'm even talking about mythological times. So the thing is, growing up, I was a big fan of the epics, our Indian mythology. I still am. I love to read the Ramayana and Mahabharata over and over again and just get the feel of it. Never forget what the stories were, and I love to blend those the supernatural elements within my stories in the current setting, and that was somewhere how my initial books shaped up to be. So that's it. I don't have a very concrete answer to it as to why I do it. How I do it is because I believe that we are all a very spiritual people, and because we are all a very spiritual people, we believe in gods, we believe in deities, and all these beliefs do shape our psyche a lot. An Indian cannot stay away from religion. We cannot, even in our day-to-day lives, and that is why I think horror is just about bringing everything to the extreme, and that is what I do with my books as well. So even in a very modern family, as you say, if you see today, you will find gods there, you will find the belief system there, you will find everything. So we do not have a very Americanized way of living at all. Our way of living is very spiritual. So that's what shines through in my stories. Coming to your question, Siddharth, I have found different kind of responses. Now, Maya's New Husband, as you know, was my biggest hit, and followed by Yakshini. Yakshini also did very, very well. I did not expect Yakshini to do so well because, as we were all talking about, it's a very old kind of title. Yakshini itself is a old title, but we had all this. But the thing is, I'm also happy that stories with my paranormal investigator friends, the spirits talk to me and haunted, have also done very well. So it's a different audience that I have for both these stories. As I said, I'm just experimenting. I'm trying to see what works. And by the way, I've got a book coming up with Vishwakarma Publications this year, Sapna's Bad Connection. So that is psychological horror. So that is something, Alisha, up your alley. I think you will.
Lovely.
You will love that.
Looking forward to this.
Yeah.
So
One last
I'll
question
see how
and,
that goes.
Yeah, one last question, and I'll put forward this to Mayur. So, Mayur, kindly tell in short, is there any similarity between the Eastern and Western aspects of horror, right? Or are they the two ends of the spectrum? So we have just
I
one or
think
two.
in Western horror there is a very strong element of consumerism. So Western culture has been based upon so horror as a genre is very strongly rooted in culture. So therefore it always is a child of the culture that it has been reared in. So Western culture has been largely a consumerism, corporate kind of a culture, and therefore a lot of that horror has some kind of a backbone of that. Whereas the Eastern horror, I mean, I'm not sure whether I've read enough of the so-called Eastern horror to answer this question. But I think Eastern horror, to a certain extent, has some amount of roots in mythology of the respective regions that they have come from, as well as some amount of, as I've said, that these are probably a little more inward-looking than the Western. So most of the time the Eastern stories as a whole, I mean, not just horror, are more inward-looking. They try to answer those bigger questions that come from within, rather than tackling an external problem to a certain extent. So that's at best a differentiation that I can think about between Western and Eastern.
Thank you very
That's a
much.
really good concept,
Thank you very
actually,
much,
Mayur.
Mayur. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mayur, Alisha, and Nisa. It was a wonderful session. I like to thank the organizers of the Pune International Literature Festival for giving us this time and space for our beloved genre. And I will always carry one important line from here, from this session, and always Neil sir mentions it here and there, that horror is not meant for B-grade or unintelligent people. Horror is meant for intelligent and brave people. So the next time you say something about horror, please remember this line. Thank you very much. I hope that you have a wonderful.
Thank you, Siddharth, and thank
Thank you
you,
so much, Siddharth.
Pune
Thank you, Neil.
Literary
Thank you,
Festival.
Alisha.
Thanks, Neil and Mayur.
Bye.
Was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye. See you.
We thank you for a very interesting session. I am sure all our listeners absolutely loved it. We thank Neil De Silva, Alisha Kirpalani, Mayur Didolkar, and Siddharth Nirwan for being our guests. We will begin our next discussion, Fact to Fiction, Making of a Novel, after a short break at 3:15 p.m. Please join us then. Thank you so much.